all the superfoods and their effect on health. Explained, these are the 21 foods sold to you as superfoods that have actually been tested on human beings, along with the exact numbers those trials produced. A few of them dropped blood pressure about as far as a prescription drug does. One of them flunked its own flagship study in front of 1,000 participants, and the word tying them all together was invented to move bananas. That banana part is not a joke. Superfood carries no scientific definition anywhere. No government body defines it, no laboratory measures it, and it appears in no nutrition textbook. No scientist coined it either. The United Fruit Company built the word in the early 20th century to pitch bananas as cheap, easily digestible daily nutrition, and it has been selling something ever since. European regulators eventually decided that was a problem worth legislating. Regulation number 1924/2006, covering nutrition and health claims, took effect on the 1st of July 2007. Under that rule, a food cannot carry vague claims like good for your heart or helps lower cholesterol, and it cannot be branded a superfood unless real science stands behind the claim. Companies got 2 years to redo their packaging. The United States never restricted the word, which explains why an American supermarket aisle still throws it around freely. The word is empty then. That matters as a starting point, because everything else rests on it. Most debunking articles stop right there, and stopping there gets it wrong. An empty word does not make the foods empty. Several items on the superfood list have run through randomized controlled trials with thousands of participants, and what came out is real, measurable, and occasionally better than people expect. Others have a photograph on a smoothie menu and nothing else. Over the next 40 minutes, I am going to separate those two groups using numbers and do it for one specific person, someone around 40. 40 is where this stops being abstract. Advice handed to a 22-year-old and advice handed to a 42-year-old should not match, because the biology underneath them does not match. By your 5th decade, several things have quietly started moving. Muscle goes first. Past the age of 30, muscle mass falls by roughly 3 to 8% per decade, and that slide speeds up after 60. Nobody clocks it at 35. It surfaces somewhere in the 40s as a shift in body composition at exactly the same body weight, and it turns clinically serious much later, because muscle is where glucose gets disposed of, and muscle is what keeps you upright when you stumble at 75. Protein needs climb alongside it. The standard adult intake sits at about 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, and that figure exists to prevent deficiency rather than to protect muscle. ESPN, the European Clinical Nutrition Body, puts healthy older adults at 1.0 to 1.2 grams per kilogram daily. Behind that recommendation sits a finding from community-dwelling older adults. The ones eating around 1.2 grams per kilogram surrendered 40% less appendicular lean mass across 3 years of follow-up than the ones eating 0.8. Among adults who already have sarcopenia, the estimated requirement climbs to 1.74 grams per kilogram, against 1.38 in those without it. In undernourished pre-frail and frail adults aged 70 to 85, a 12-week trial found 1.5 grams per kilogram delivered the most benefit, beating both 0.8 and 1.2. Fiber is the second gap, and it is enormous. 25 grams a day is the United States recommendation for women under 50, and 38 grams for men. Actual average intake runs near 17 grams. Only about 5% of the population clears the target, and men, who need more, average less than women do. None of that is a rounding error. Most of the population lives permanently below the intake at which fiber's benefits were ever observed. Health economists have priced the shortfall. Nudging fiber up by 3 grams a day across half the adult population could save more than $2 billion annually in constipation-related care alone, and reaching the full 25 grams could save an estimated $12.7 billion. Blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, arterial stiffness, bone density, and gut microbial diversity are all drifting during the same stretch of years. That is the context that makes food land differently now than it did at 25. So let us walk the list. The most startling single finding in this whole subject came out of the Memory and Aging Project, a long-running study of cognitive aging in older adults. 960 participants aged 58 to 99 filled out food frequency questionnaires and sat at least 2 cognitive assessments across a mean assessment window of 4.7 years. Participants at the top of the range averaged about 1.3 servings of green leafy vegetables a day. At the bottom, the average came to 0.1 servings, which amounts to essentially none. Cognitive decline in that top group ran slower by 0.05 standardized units per year. Put into terms a person can picture, the gap between the two groups matched being 11 years younger in age. The dose was 1 serving a day of spinach, kale, collards, or lettuce. Researchers named the constituents most tied to the effect, and the list runs phylloquinone, which is vitamin K1, plus lutein, nitrate, folate, alpha-tocopherol, and camphorol. This was observational work, so it cannot establish cause, and people who eat salad differ from people who skip it in 100 other ways. The effect size is still large, the follow-up still long, and the dose still 1 serving. Berries get marketed harder than anything else on the superfood list, and the evidence genuinely splits both ways, which is worth stating out loud. Start with the trial that worked. 61 healthy adults aged 65 to 80 received either 26 grams of freeze-dried wild blueberry powder carrying 302 milligrams of anthocyanins, or a matched placebo holding 0. They took it daily for 12 weeks, while researchers tracked cognitive function, endothelial function, arterial stiffness, blood pressure, and cerebral blood flow. The blueberry group came out with improvements in vascular function and in cognitive performance. Now the trial that did not. Across 6 months of double-blind randomized testing in participants with metabolic syndrome, neither dose of wild blueberry powder moved cognitive performance or cardiovascular measures at 3 months or at 6. A separate arm running wild blueberry extract for 3 months did improve delayed word recognition memory, while also lowering systolic blood pressure. Here is where that leaves things. Anthocyanin and blueberry intake tracks positively with cognitive function across population studies, and the randomized trials show their clearest benefit in people who already carry measurable cognitive dysfunction. In healthy people, the findings scatter. Berries earn a place in the diet. They do not earn the word insurance. No single food on this list carries stronger evidence, and an integrity story rides along with it that makes the case sturdier rather than shakier. PrediMed randomized 7,447 adults at high cardiovascular risk across Spain into 3 arms: a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, the same diet supplemented with mixed nuts, or a reduced fat control diet. Median follow-up stretched 4.8 years. Against that control diet, the olive oil arm posted a 31% relative reduction in the combined endpoint of heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death. The part usually left out comes next. On the 13th of June 2018, the New England Journal of Medicine retracted the original 2013 paper over randomization errors touching a portion of participants. The authors reanalyzed everything with appropriate statistical handling, and the journal republished it that same year. The conclusion survived intact. Major cardiovascular events landed lower in the olive oil arm and lower in the nut arm than in the reduced fat arm. A trial that got audited, corrected, republished, and still showed its effect deserves more trust than a trial nobody ever checked. Extra virgin olive oil is the one item here where the evidence alone justifies changing your default cooking fat this week. Dietary guidance converges on 2 seafood servings a week at minimum, aiming for at least 250 milligrams a day of combined EPA and DHA, which totals roughly 1,750 milligrams weekly, ideally from oily fish. The historical evidence propping up that advice is strong. In the DART trial, male heart attack survivors told to eat 200 to 400 grams of fatty fish weekly, which handed them an extra 500 to 800 milligrams of omega-3 a day, cut all-cause mortality by 29% over 2 years. Secondary prevention evidence runs the same direction, with EPA and DHA intakes from 0.5 to 1.8 grams daily, reducing both cardiac and all-cause mortality. The caveat gets buried far too often, so here it is. A major systematic review concluded that moderate to high-quality evidence shows increasing EPA and DHA produces little or no effect on mortality or cardiovascular health. That evidence draws mainly on supplement trials, while the positive evidence draws mainly on people eating fish. Two consequences follow. DART ran in the 1980s before modern statins and revascularization existed, so its effect size almost certainly shrinks in a well-treated patient today. And the fish and the capsule are not interchangeable, which is precisely what the trials keep demonstrating. These numbers come from dose-response meta-analysis of prospective cohorts, and they hold steady across studies. For every 28 grams a day of additional nut intake, the summary relative risk for all-cause mortality came to 0.78, with a confidence interval running 0.72 to 0.84. At 30 grams a day of total nuts and seeds, cardiovascular risk reductions match what you see comparing the heaviest consumers against the lightest. Walnuts specifically track with lower incidence of cardiovascular disease, stroke, and coronary heart disease. Within the PURE study, walnut consumption tracked with lower mortality at a hazard ratio of 0.79, confidence interval 0.67 to 0.92. Higher nut intake also tracks with lower mortality from respiratory disease, diabetes, and infections. A pattern that broad suggests either something systemic is happening or that daily nut eaters differ from everyone else in ways no questionnaire captures. Probably both are true. 28 grams is a small handful, which makes it one of the few numbers here you can hit without thinking about it. Ask which single food group holds the strongest association with living longer, and the data does not answer with a berry or a seed. It answers with beans. The study came out of the Food Habits in Later Life project, published in 2004. Roughly 785 adults aged 70 and over sat across 5 cohorts in Japan, Sweden, Greece, and Australia. One of them a Japanese-Australian sample. Baseline dietary data was gathered between 1988 and 1991, with 7 years of follow-up after that. For every 20 gram a day increase in legume intake, mortality hazard dropped 7 to 8%, whether or not the analysis controlled for ethnicity. The authors concluded that higher legume intake stood as the most protective dietary predictor of survival among the elderly, regardless of ethnicity. 20 grams a day is nothing. It comes to a couple of tablespoons of cooked beans. That same pattern surfaces independently in the populations where reaching 100 barely registers as unusual. Black beans in Nicoya, fava beans and chickpeas in Sardinia and Icaria, soy in Okinawa. All of them eat considerably more beans than the Western average. The data is old, gathered between 1988 and 1991, and it is observational. Beans are also the cheapest item on this entire list, which tilts the risk-to-reward arithmetic in a way nothing else here does. Oats hold a distinction nothing else on this list can claim. Regulators formally accepted the effect. High molecular weight oat beta-glucan, eaten at 3 to 4 grams a day, lowers LDL cholesterol by a median of roughly 6.5%. The meta-analytic backing runs deep. 58 trials covering 3,974 participants at a median dose of 3.5 grams a day found LDL cholesterol down by 0.19 millimoles per liter, confidence interval 0.23 to 0.14, p-value below 0.00001. That same analysis registered reductions in non-HDL cholesterol and in apolipoprotein B. At 3 grams a day or more, LDL fell by 0.25 millimoles per liter. Trials handing participants 3 to 12.4 grams a day put LDL 11.6 milligrams per deciliter below control. Regulatory agencies across the United States, Canada, and Europe all permit a claim that 3 grams of oat beta-glucan daily helps reduce blood cholesterol. Rare thing in nutrition, that. 2 details decide whether you actually collect the benefit. The dose has to reach 3 grams, which is more oats than most people picture. And the beta-glucan has to stay high molecular weight, which heavy processing wrecks. An instant flavored oat sachet is not the material those trials used. Sulforaphane drives the interest in broccoli, and the recent human work gets far more specific than the usual antioxidant hand-waving. Inside a randomized placebo-controlled trial in prediabetes, a broccoli sprout extract delivering 150 micromoles of sulforaphane per dose improved glucose tolerance as much as pure sulforaphane did. Strip the sulforaphane out of that extract, and the effect vanished, which pins it as the active component rather than a passenger. A separate randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial ran from April to December 2021, testing a glucoraphanin-enriched broccoli sprout supplement in healthy middle-aged adults whose liver markers sat high normal. Serum ALT improved significantly by 24 weeks. Serum glutathione showed no difference between groups. Not every result landed. In a 2024 study, sulforaphane supplementation failed to shift NRF2 or NF-kappa B gene expression in hemodialysis patients. Bioavailability is where this food lives or dies. Broccoli contains no sulforaphane at all. It contains glucoraphanin, and an enzyme called myrosinase performs the conversion. Without active myrosinase, bioavailability averages around 10%. With it, roughly 40%. A four-fold swing rides on one enzyme, which is why the old advice to chop broccoli, let it stand, and stop boiling it into surrender turns out to have a mechanism underneath. This is the trial that caught the field off guard. It came out of Stanford in July of 2021. 36 healthy adults were randomized across 10 weeks onto a diet high in either fermented foods or high-fiber foods. The fermented arm worked through yogurt, kefir, fermented cottage cheese, kimchi, other fermented vegetables, vegetable brine drinks, and kombucha. Overall microbial diversity rose in the fermented group and rose further at larger servings. 19 inflammatory proteins measured in blood came down. 4 types of immune cells showed less activation. The high-fiber group is where it gets interesting. Not one of the 19 inflammatory proteins decreased, and microbial diversity held steady on average. That result cuts straight across the standard advice, which boils down to eat more fiber. Fiber is not useless, and these same researchers have published extensively on why it matters. What the trial suggests is that fermented foods did something to inflammation and to diversity that fiber alone did not do here. Size is the limitation. 36 people, 10 weeks, still unreplicated at scale. Treat it as a strong signal rather than a settled fact. Beets run on a specific pathway. Dietary nitrate converts to nitrite. Nitrite converts to nitric oxide, and nitric oxide relaxes blood vessels. Meta-analytic estimates cluster inside a range. Overall, you see about 3.12 millimeters of mercury off systolic and 1.43 off diastolic. Narrow it to beetroot juice, and the figures read 4.68 systolic and 2.35 diastolic. Some analyses land higher still, reaching 5.33 systolic and 3.01 diastolic. 2 qualifications carry weight. Beetroot juice lowers clinic systolic blood pressure with a significant effect demonstrated out to 90 days of intervention, though the evidence does not support a sustained 24-hour reduction. And the effect grows larger in older subjects, which researchers attribute mainly to structural change in their arteries and to large artery stiffness. That second point aims directly at a 40-year-old, because arterial stiffness is exactly what starts shifting now. The largest blood pressure effect any food produced in a randomized trial belongs to flaxseed, and the trial deserves describing precisely. It was published in 2013. The design was prospective, double-blinded, placebo-controlled, and randomized, running 110 patients with peripheral artery disease, aged 59 to 75, whose mean baseline blood pressure sat at 143/77. For 6 months, they ate foods containing 30 grams of milled flaxseed daily. Systolic blood pressure came down roughly 10 millimeters of mercury, and diastolic came down about 7. For a dietary intervention that is a large number, sitting in the range where you would expect a real reduction in cardiovascular events. Later meta-analyses confirmed the direction in people carrying cardiovascular risk factors, generally with smaller pooled effects than the original trial produced. Nutrition science does that routinely. One word in the protocol carries enormous weight, and the word is milled. Whole flaxseed travels through you largely untouched. Cosmos, the cocoa supplement and multivitamin outcome study, published in 2022, was the first large-scale randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled test of long-term cocoa flavanol supplementation against cardiovascular disease and cancer. Participants were older women and men. Median treatment ran 3.6 years, and the dose came to 500 milligrams of cocoa flavanols daily, including 80 milligrams of epicatechin, against placebo. Total cardiovascular events was the primary outcome, and on that outcome the trial found no statistically significant effect. That headline belongs first. Cardiovascular death fell 27%, and that reduction was statistically significant. Other individual cardiovascular outcomes moved nowhere significant. In the per-protocol analysis, which excluded participants who did not take the pills as directed, total cardiovascular events dropped a significant 15%, and cardiovascular death dropped a significant 39%. A missed primary endpoint, paired with a significant secondary endpoint, makes a promising result, not a proven one. One more thing worth registering. What got tested was a cocoa flavanol extract, not chocolate. A chocolate bar hands you sugar and fat alongside a far less predictable flavanol dose. The Osaki study tracked 40,530 adults across Miyagi Prefecture in northern Japan for 11 years. Green tea consumption ran inversely with all-cause mortality and with cardiovascular mortality. Drinkers taking 5 or more cups a day showed significantly lower cardiovascular disease mortality, stroke mortality especially, than those drinking under 1 cup a day. Among women, that inverse association with all-cause mortality ran stronger. A pooled analysis of 8 population-based Japanese cohorts, published in 2019, points the same way. GG usually gets the credit, epigallocatechin 3-gallate, the most prevalent and bioactive catechin in green tea. Proposed mechanisms run through improved vascular endothelial function and reduced systemic oxidative stress markers. 2 limitations belong on the record. The work is observational, and drinking 5 cups of green tea a day in Japan travels alongside an entire cluster of other behaviors. The baseline data also dates from the 1990s. Tomatoes demonstrate better than anything else how preparation rewrites the dose. Lycopene turns more bioavailable from cooked tomatoes, because heat dismantles cell walls and separates lycopene from its carrier proteins. Cook them in oil and absorption climbs substantially further, since lycopene is fat-soluble and strongly lipophilic. Raw tomato in a salad and tomato paste simmered in olive oil do not deliver the same quantity of the compound. On outcomes, the evidence genuinely divides. Across the health professionals' follow-up study from 1986 to 1998, lycopene intake tracked with reduced prostate cancer risk, and tomato sauce, being the primary source of bioavailable lycopene, tracked with an even larger reduction. Those associations held after controlling for total fruit and vegetable consumption and for olive oil use. Other analyses tell a different story. In a reassessment covering the PSA screening era, lycopene intake showed no association with prostate cancer risk, and no reduced risk turned up for total tomato servings or for most individual tomato foods. So the bioavailability science stands solid while the outcome data wobbles. Cooked tomatoes with olive oil remains a good habit on general grounds. It is not a prostate insurance policy. 12 trials covering 553 hypertensive participants were pooled in a meta-analysis, and garlic supplements lowered systolic blood pressure by 8.3 plus or minus 1.9 millimeters of mercury, with diastolic down 5.5 plus or minus 1.9. The authors called that similar in magnitude to standard antihypertensive medication. They also note that a blood pressure reduction of that size associates with a 16 to 40% lower risk of cardiovascular events. That figure is a modeled inference drawn from blood pressure epidemiology, not something the garlic trials measured, and it should be understood on those terms. Aged garlic extract produced a dose-response blood pressure reduction in hypertensive patients in a trial published in 2013. The wider literature is heterogeneous, with effects hinging on dose, duration, and baseline blood pressure. Results sharpen in people whose blood pressure already runs high, which turns out to be the general rule across nearly every food here. Mushrooms are the leading dietary source, by a wide margin, of a compound called ergothioneine. It is a sulfur-containing, amino acid-derived molecule that nature produces only through certain fungi and a handful of microbes. Humans carry a dedicated transporter that actively absorbs it and holds it in tissue, which is unusual enough that it explains most of the research interest. Some researchers have floated calling it a longevity vitamin. The evidence needs careful framing. Laboratory work shows potent antioxidant and anti-inflammatory activity. In mice, ergothioneine dampens the inflammatory response triggered by UV exposure, and lowers markers of oxidative damage in skin. Human outcome trials do not exist yet. All of this is mechanistically interesting and preliminary, and anyone selling it as a proven anti-aging intervention has run out well ahead of the data. One mushroom fact is entirely practical. Ultraviolet irradiation raises vitamin D2 content substantially, and pulsed UV methods work at industrial scale while preserving high ergothioneine. UV-exposed mushrooms are a real vitamin D source inside a food supply that offers very few. 14 trials with 573 participants were pooled, and pomegranate juice reduced systolic blood pressure by 5.02 millimeters of mercury. A larger and more recent meta-analysis, running 33 randomized controlled trials with 1,490 participants aged 20 to 75, found smaller movement, 3.52 systolic and 1.50 diastolic. Pomegranate also brought down the inflammatory markers IL-6 and ICAM-1. The dose pattern runs backwards from what you would guess. 300 milliliters a day or less reduced systolic blood pressure by 6.11 millimeters. Above 300 milliliters, systolic went nowhere, though diastolic still fell significantly. Interventions lasting 2 months or less delivered 4.59 systolic and 2.94 diastolic. More juice did not buy more benefit. 2 mechanisms get proposed. Punicalagin, pomegranate's main alagitanin, behaves somewhat like an AC inhibitor, cutting angiotensin II production and encouraging vasodilation. Separately, gut bacteria convert pomegranate alagitanins into urolithin A, a metabolite that switches on mitophagy, the process cells use to clear out damaged mitochondria. That conversion depends on your microbiome, and plenty of people produce urolithin A poorly. Bone density is not where you expect a fruit to show up, and the trial behind it was built well. The prune study ran at Penn State from June 2016 through February 2021 and reached print in October 2022. 235 postmenopausal women, aged 55 to 75, mean age 62, were randomized across 3 groups for 12 months. Control, 50 grams of prunes a day or 100 grams a day. At 50 grams a day, loss of total hip bone mineral density stopped by 6 months, and the effect held at 12. The dropout data teaches as much as the bone data does. Compliance reached 90.2% in the 50-gram group and 87.1% in the 100-gram group. Overall dropout came to 22%, but inside the 100-gram group it hit 41%, against 10% in control and 15% at 50 grams. Doubling the dose did not double the benefit. It roughly quadrupled the number of women who walked away. A 2024 follow-up found gut microbiome composition differed between responders and non-responders. The kiwi and sleep study gets cited constantly and described accurately almost never, so here it is whole. It was published in 2011. 24 subjects, 2 men and 22 women, age 20 to 55, all reporting sleep disturbance. Ate 2 kiwi fruit 1 hour before bed every night for 4 weeks. Assessment ran through the Chinese version of the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, a 3-day sleep diary, and an actigraph watch. The reported results look extraordinary. Sleep Quality Index score fell 42.4%. Waking time after sleep onset fell 28.9%. Sleep onset latency fell 35.4%. Total sleep time rose 13.4%, and sleep efficiency rose 5.41%. The design does not support taking any of that at face value. 24 people, no placebo control, a single arm, and a sample that was almost entirely women. 2 kiwi fruit before bed costs nothing and might help you. Those percentages should never be quoted as established effects. For women moving through perimenopause in their 40s, soy carries the most directly relevant evidence on this list. A meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials found soy isoflavones at a median dose of 54 milligrams a day, measured in aglycone equivalents and taken anywhere from 6 weeks to 12 months, reduced hot flash frequency by 20.6% and severity by 26.2% against placebo. Reframed in daily terms, that comes to about 1.3 fewer hot flashes a day. Why soy works for some women and not others appears to come down to a compound called iqual. Gut bacteria convert the soy isoflavone didzine into equal, and plenty of microbiomes never manage it. Across a meta-analysis of randomized trials, supplying equal directly lowered hot flash incidence and severity in equal non-producers. Dose matters too. Supplements carrying more than 18.8 milligrams of genistein, the median across studies, proved more than twice as potent at cutting hot flash frequency as lower genistein products. The effect is modest, and nothing here substitutes for hormone therapy. It also illustrates a theme threaded through this whole subject, which is that whether a food works on you can hinge on which bacteria you happen to be carrying. Avocado earns its place on this list precisely because its flagship trial failed. The Habitual Diet and Avocado Trial was a multi-center, randomized, controlled, parallel-arm study covering 1,008 adults with abdominal obesity. The first participant was randomized on the 27th of June, 2018, and data collection wrapped in October 2020. The intervention group ate 1 avocado a day, about 168 grams, for 26 weeks, while the control group carried on as usual, with no more than 2 avocados a month. Change in visceral adipose tissue volume was the primary outcome, and the two groups finished essentially identical. Visceral fat rose 0.074 liters in the avocado group and 0.057 liters in the habitual diet group. Daily avocado did not reduce visceral fat, and it exerted minimal effect on cardiometabolic risk factors. What did move was diet quality. Dietary fiber, total fat, monounsaturated fat, and healthy eating index score all came out significantly higher in the avocado group. That is the single most useful result in this entire video, because it exposes what adding one food to a diet actually accomplishes. It improves the composition of what you eat. It does not behave like a drug aimed at one outcome. 1,008 people ate an avocado every day for 6 months, and their visceral fat did not budge. Some items reached the superfood list on the strength of their label design. Goji berries have preliminary in vitro work on breast and liver cancer cells, meaning cells sitting in a dish. No evidence shows a cancer treatment effect in humans, and the marketing grew aggressive enough that the FDA moved against companies promoting goji as a natural cancer cure. Spirulina runs more than 60% protein by weight, which sounds formidable until you check the serving size. 6 grams, the typical serving, hands you about 3.6 grams of protein. Set that against a 40-year-old's daily requirement of roughly 90 grams and it disappears. Its broader health claims lack scientific support. Acai gets marketed heavily on a thin human trial base. Moringa contains antioxidants, flavonoids, phenolic acids, and isothiocyanates, which makes it mechanistically interesting and nothing further, because human outcome data remains insufficient. Consumer protection bodies and Harvard's nutrition department land in the same place on the general pattern. Claimed health-promoting properties of individual superfoods usually go unsubstantiated, and research on what protects people from lifestyle disease keeps pointing at dietary patterns instead of individual foods. One item marketed as a superfood appears to work in reverse. Coconut oil runs 82% saturated fat, 6% monounsaturated, and 2% polyunsaturated. Pooled across 16 clinical trials and compared against non-tropical vegetable oils like sunflower, canola, and olive, coconut oil raised total cholesterol by about 15 milligrams per deciliter, LDL by about 10, and HDL by about 4. The American Heart Association's 2017 Presidential Advisory on Dietary Fats and Cardiovascular Disease concluded that coconut oil raises LDL with no known offsetting benefit, and that given LDL's causal role in cardiovascular disease, no cardiovascular benefit should be expected. On saturated fat grounds, nothing meaningful separates coconut oil from butter, beef fat, or palm oil. Everything above provokes the same instinct in most people, which is to go looking for the pill. There is a specific reason that fails, and nutrition science holds an unusually clean demonstration of it. Observational studies kept finding that people eating beta-carotene-rich vegetables had lower lung cancer rates, so researchers ran the obvious experiment and gave people beta-carotene. In the alpha-tocopherol beta-carotene cancer prevention study, Beta-carotene supplementation raised lung cancer incidence by 18% among smokers and produced an 8% excess in overall mortality. In the beta-carotene and retinol efficacy trial, covering more than 18,000 men and women, the group receiving beta-carotene with retinol palmitate developed 28% more lung cancers and suffered 17% more deaths after an average of 4 years. Both trials used 20 to 30 milligrams a day of synthetic beta-carotene in heavy smokers carrying 20 or more pack years and in asbestos workers. The vegetables protected people. The isolated compound killed some of them. That is the single most important fact in this entire subject, because it demolishes the reasoning holding up most of the supplement industry, which runs, find the active ingredient, concentrate it, sell it. Curcumin shows the same problem from the opposite end. Curcumin absorbs poorly by mouth, leaves mostly in the feces, and its extremely poor water solubility caps both bioavailability and therapeutic effect. 20 milligrams of piperine, the alkaloid inside black pepper, can raise curcumin absorption by as much as 2,000% by inhibiting hepatic and intestinal glucuronidation, lifting serum concentration and stretching half-life. Other workarounds include liposomal and nanoparticle formulations, phospholipid complexes, dispersion in a lipophilic matrix, and pairing curcumin with turmeric's own volatile oils. Read that backwards, and it tells you most turmeric capsules on a shelf deliver very little curcumin into your bloodstream. The traditional preparation, turmeric, cooked with fat and black pepper, was solving a pharmacokinetic problem centuries before anyone had the vocabulary to describe it. All of it collapses into a handful of rules. Preparation rewrites the dose, sometimes more powerfully than the food choice does. Cook tomatoes, and cook them in oil. Chop broccoli and let it stand before heat touches it. And stop boiling it, because myrosinase has to convert glucoraphanin into sulforaphane, and that enzyme separates roughly 10% bioavailability from roughly 40%. Use milled flaxseed rather than whole. Pair turmeric with black pepper and fat. Buy oats that still look like oats, since the beta-glucan has to stay high molecular weight, and you need 3 grams of it a day. Doses run lower than people assume, and occasionally lower beats higher outright. 28 grams of nuts, 20 grams of legumes, 1 serving of leafy greens, 50 grams of prunes instead of 100, 300 milliliters of pomegranate juice instead of more. Nearly every effect on this list was measured in people who already had something wrong with them. Elevated blood pressure, high cholesterol, prediabetes, existing cognitive decline, abdominal obesity, peripheral artery disease. The blood pressure foods perform best in people with high blood pressure. The cognition findings sharpen in people with measurable decline. If your numbers already look good, expect the effects to come in smaller than the headlines promised. 2 things that nobody calls superfoods matter more than all 21 combined. Protein comes first, at 1.0 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight daily, rather than the deficiency prevention figure of 0.8, because you are shedding 3 to 8% of your muscle per decade, and the people eating more of it held on to 40% more lean mass across 3 years. Fiber comes second, at 25 grams for women under 50 and 38 for men, against an average intake of 17 grams that only about 5% of people ever clear. No quantity of acai powder rescues a diet stuck at 17 grams of fiber. Single foods also do not behave like drugs. 1,008 people ate an avocado a day for 6 months. Their visceral fat sat unchanged, and their overall diet quality improved. That is the realistic mechanism. Foods shift the composition of what you eat, and composition is what the outcome data has always been tracking. Superfood was invented to sell bananas, and Europe restricted the word in 2007 because it kept getting stuck on foods with nothing behind them. All of that is fair. Underneath the marketing, though, some of these foods carry real trial data. 7,447 people in Spain, a 31% reduction in cardiovascular events on extra virgin olive oil, in a trial that was retracted, corrected, republished, and still held its result. Around 785 older adults across 4 countries, 7 to 8% lower mortality hazard for every 20 grams of legumes a day, 960 older adults, 1 serving of leafy greens daily, Cognitive decline slower by the equivalent of 11 years of age. 110 patients, 30 grams of milled flaxseed, 10 millimeters of mercury off systolic blood pressure. 3 grams of oat beta-glucan a day, 6.5% off LDL cholesterol, a claim regulators accepted on 3 continents. Others carry nothing at all. Goji berries in a dish of cells, spirulina delivering 3.6 grams of protein, coconut oil pushing your LDL up 10 points, while the label calls it a health food. What separates the two groups has nothing to do with which food looks exotic or costs the most per gram. It comes down to which ones were fed to actual human beings for months against a control group, with the results published whichever way they fell. Beans, oats, leafy greens, olive oil, nuts, fatty fish, fermented foods, and flaxseed clear that bar. With the single exception of the fish, they also sit among the cheapest things in the shop. At 40, the biology has already started moving. Muscle is leaving. Arteries are stiffening. Bone density has begun its slow retreat. What the evidence says about responding to that is neither exotic nor expensive. It says beans, greens, oats, olive oil, a handful of nuts, fish twice a week, something fermented, and enough protein and fiber to register. Everything else on the superfood shelf is optional, and a fair amount of it is just packaging.